I remember that day like it was yesterday, though 32 years have passed since then. Spring of 1991. I was 11 years old in 6th grade at Westridge Middle School, and the cherry blossoms were just beginning to dust the sidewalks with their pale pink confetti. The air smelled of possibility and freshly cut grass. But inside the school hallways, the fluorescent lights cast the same sterile glow they always did, turning everyone's skin a sickly shade of yellow-green. Name is Maya Johnson, and I loved books more than anything in the world. When other kids were trading stickers or obsessing over the latest music groups, I was lost between pages, discovering worlds that made me feel less alone. That spring, we had an assignment in Ms. Peterson's English class to write a report on a historical figure who had overcome adversity. I knew exactly who I wanted to write about. Phyllis Wheatley, the first published African-American female poet. My mother had told me about her years before, and something about Phyllis's story resonated with me. A young girl, kidnapped from her home in West Africa, brought to America on a slave ship, and yet somehow finding her voice through poetry, finding freedom in words when her body remained in chains. I wanted to understand how someone could transform pain into beauty like that. The school library was my sanctuary. Mrs. Fowler, our usual librarian, was a sweet elderly woman with silver-rimmed glasses and hands that smelled like lavender lotion. She always greeted me with a warm smile and often saved books she thought I might enjoy. But that day, Mrs. Fowler wasn't there. Instead, Mrs. Blackwell stood behind the circulation desk, her pinched face bent over a ledger, her red pen making aggressive marks as though she were stabbing the paper rather than writing on it. Mrs. Blackwell had been at Westridge for as long as anyone could remember. She taught advanced literature for 8th graders and ran the debate team. But more than anything, she was known for her strictness. Some kids said she'd made Bobby Atkins cry during a poetry recitation the year before. Others whispered that she'd been around so long she probably taught Shakespeare himself. I hesitated at the library entrance, my permission slip from Ms. Peterson clutched in my hand. The library was mostly empty during this period. Just a couple of 8th graders huddled over a science project in the corner, and the quiet felt thick, like the air before a thunderstorm. Taking a deep breath, I approached the desk. "Excuse me, Mrs. Blackwell? I have a pass to use the library during this period. I need to research for my history report." Mrs. Blackwell looked up, her eyes magnified behind her thick glasses, making them appear owl-like and unsettling. She stared at me for a long moment before holding out her hand for my pass. I placed it in her palm, noticing how dry and cool her skin felt against mine. "Maya Johnson," she read aloud, her voice flat as a pressed flower. "Miss Peterson's class." She placed the pass on the desk and folded her hands on top of it. "And what are you researching today?" "Phyllis Wheatley," I answered, unable to hide the excitement in my voice. "She was a poet in colonial America, and I know who Phyllis Wheatley was." Mrs. Blackwell interrupted, her lips thinning to a barely visible line. "The biography section is currently closed for inventory." I blinked, confused. The biography section looked perfectly accessible from where I stood, with no signs or barriers indicating it was off-limits. "Oh, well, maybe there's something in the general history section about her, or in American literature." Mrs. Blackwell's eyes never left my face, but something in them had changed, hardened like ice forming on a pond. "I think you should choose another subject, Maya. Something more appropriate for your level." Heat rushed to my cheeks. My level? Perhaps someone more contemporary, more accessible. She slid my pass back across the desk. "Someone like Harriet Tubman All the children enjoy reading about her." I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. Harriet Tubman was incredible, of course, but her story wasn't what had captured my imagination. And Mrs. Blackwell's emphasis on all the children stung in a way I couldn't quite articulate. But I'm really interested in poetry. And Phyllis, Wheatley... Maya. Mrs. Blackwell cut me off again, her voice lowering to a near whisper that somehow felt louder than a shout. "Some books simply aren't for you. I'm steering you toward resources that would be more beneficial." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I stood frozen, my hands suddenly clammy, aware of the 8th graders glancing over curiously. I wanted to argue, to tell her that I read at a 12th grade level, according to last year's assessment, that I'd already devoured books much more complex than a simple biography. But something in her expression, a certainty, a dismissal, stopped, the words in my throat. "In fact," she continued, standing up and walking around the desk until she stood between me and the library entrance, "I think you should return during your regular class library time when Mrs. Fowler is here. She's much better equipped to help students like you find appropriate reading material. Students like you." The words echoed in my head, clear in their meaning though cloaked in politeness. I looked past Mrs. Blackwell to the rows of books, so close yet suddenly unreachable, and felt a burning behind my eyes that I refused to let become tears. "Is there a problem?" One of the 8th grade students had approached, a tall boy with glasses and a concerned expression. "No problem at all, Thomas," Mrs. Blackwell said smoothly. Maya was just leaving to rethink her research topic. She placed a firm hand on my shoulder, turning me toward the exit. "But," I started to protest. "Run along now," she said with finality. "Your next class will be starting soon." I walked out of the library, my vision blurring despite my determination not to cry. The hallway stretched before me, empty and silent except for the distant sound of a teacher's voice filtering through a classroom door. I didn't have another class to go to. This was my research period. I had nowhere to be and 45 minutes to fill with my humiliation. I found myself in the girls' bathroom, locked in a stall, sitting on the closed toilet lid with my knees pulled up to my chest. The tears came then, hot and angry, streaming down my face as I pressed my forehead against my knees. It wasn't the first time I'd felt the sting of being treated differently, but it was the first time it had kept me from something I loved. Books, knowledge, stories. When the bell rang, I splashed cold water on my face, ignored my red-rimmed eyes in the mirror, and headed to my next class. I went through the motions for the rest of the day, answering when called on, nodding at appropriate moments. But inside I felt hollow, as if Mrs. Blackwell had reached into my chest and scooped out something vital. The walk home that afternoon was long. Usually I'd be mentally composing stories or reciting poems in my head, but that day my thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and hurt. The sidewalk beneath my feet cracked and uneven, mirroring how I felt inside. Our house was a modest 2-story with fading yellow paint and a small front porch where my mother kept potted plants that somehow survived, despite her self-proclaimed black thumb. But as I approached, I noticed an unfamiliar car in the driveway, a sleek black sedan that looked out of place in our working-class neighborhood. When I opened the front door, voices drifted from the kitchen. My mother's warm laugh and another voice, rich and familiar, that made my heart skip with recognition. "There she is!" my mother called as I dropped my backpack by the door. "Look who surprised us with a visit." Sitting at our kitchen table, a mug of tea cradled between her elegant hands, was my Aunt Josephine, Not my actual aunt. She was my mother's college roommate. But she'd been Aunt Jo to me since before I could remember. She rose from her chair, arms outstretched, and I ran into them like I was 6 instead of 11, breathing in her familiar scent of vanilla and something spicy I could never identify. "My favorite niece," she said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "Getting taller every time I see you." Aunt Jo wasn't just my mother's best friend. She was Josephine Rivers, the award-winning author whose novels about Black women's experiences throughout American history were taught in colleges across the country. Her latest book had just been adapted into a film starring Angela Bassett. She was brilliant, accomplished, and to me, she hung the moon and stars. "What are you doing here?" I asked, pulling back to look at her. Aunt Jo lived in New York, and her visits were rare and treasured events. "I thought you were on your book tour." "I had a signing in Chicago yesterday, and I couldn't be that close without stopping to see my 2 favorite people," she explained, guiding me to sit at the table, where a plate of cookies waited. "Besides, I wanted to give you this in person." She reached into her elegant leather bag and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The shape was unmistakably a book. I carefully undid the string and unwrapped the paper to reveal a beautiful hardcover edition of collected poems by Phyllis Wheatley. "I remembered how much you loved the story I told you about her last Christmas," Aunt Jo said, watching my face with a gentle smile. "It's a special edition with historical context and some recently discovered letters. I thought it might inspire you." I ran my fingers over the embossed cover, feeling the raised lettering of Wheatley's name. The coincidence was too perfect, too painful. Before I could stop myself, I was crying again, silent tears falling onto the pristine cover. "Maya!" My mother moved to my side instantly, her arm around my shoulders. "What's wrong, baby?" Between sobs, I told them about Mrs. Blackwell, the library, the words that cut deeper than any playground taunt ever had. As I spoke, my mother's expression shifted from concern to a controlled anger I rarely saw. Aunt Jo remained very still, her face a careful mask, but her eyes burned with something I couldn't name. "Some books aren't for you," Aunt Jo repeated quietly when I finished. She reached across the table and took my hand. "Maya, look at me." I raised my eyes to meet hers. "There is no book in this world that isn't for you. No story you don't have the right to discover. No knowledge you don't deserve to possess." Her voice was steady, but beneath it ran a current of steel. "Tomorrow, you're going to take this book to school, and you're going to write the best report on Phyllis Wheatley that Miss Peterson has ever read." "But Mrs. Blackwell won't let me in the library," I whispered. A smile spread across Aunt Jo's face, not the warm one I was used to, but something sharper, almost predatory. "Don't worry about Mrs. Blackwell. I think I'll pay a visit to Westridge tomorrow. It's been a while since I've spoken to young students about the power of literature." That night I stayed up late reading the book Aunt Jo had given me, absorbing Phyllis Wheatley's words, her life, her struggles, and her triumphs. With each page, the hollow feeling Mrs. Blackwell had created began to fill with something stronger, a sense of connection, of belonging to a lineage of minds that had refused limitation. The next morning I dressed with unusual care, putting on the navy blue dress my mother had bought for special occasions, and pulling my hair back with a matching headband. The book went into my backpack, along with the notes I'd already started for my report. My mother was quieter than usual as she drove me to school, but she squeezed my hand before I got out of the car. "Head up, baby," she said. Remember who you are? The morning passed in a blur of anticipation. By lunchtime, word had spread through the school that Josephine Rivers, yes, the Josephine Rivers, would be giving a special presentation in the auditorium during the last period. Teachers whispered excitedly in hallways, and even the coolest 8th graders seemed impressed. When the final bell rang, students streamed toward the auditorium. I hung back, unsure of what Aunt Jo had planned and nervous about what it might mean for me afterward. As I hesitated in the hallway, Miss Peterson appeared beside me. "Maya, there you are. Your aunt specifically asked if you could help backstage before the presentation." She guided me through a side door that led behind the auditorium stage, where Aunt Jo stood talking with Principal Warner and several other teachers. Aunt Jo looked different today, more formal in a crisp white blouse and a tailored burgundy suit that matched her lipstick. Her hair was swept up in an elegant twist, and she wore the gold earrings my mother had given her for her 40th birthday. When she saw me, she broke into a wide smile and beckoned me over. "Here's my assistant for the day," she announced, placing an arm around my shoulders. Maya knows my presentation routine better than anyone. I had no idea what she meant. I'd never assisted her at an event before, but I nodded as though this were completely normal. Principal Warner beamed, clearly thrilled to have a celebrity in the school, while the other teachers murmured appreciatively. Only Mrs. Blackwell, standing slightly apart from the group, looked uncomfortable, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Mrs. Blackwell," Aunt Jo said, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes sharp as flint. "I believe we haven't been properly introduced. I'm Josephine Rivers, Maya's aunt." Mrs. Blackwell extended a stiff hand. "Yes, of course. We're honored to have you visit our school, Ms. Rivers. Your work is quite progressive." "Thank you," Aunt Jo replied, holding on to Mrs. Blackwell's hand a moment longer than necessary. "I understand you're in charge of the library currently. I'd love to speak with you about the collections after my presentation. I'm always interested in what young minds have access to." Something passed between them, a current of understanding that made Mrs. Blackwell withdraw her hand quickly. "Of course," she said, though her tone suggested she'd rather do anything else. Principal Warner checked his watch. "We should get started. The students are all seated." He turned to me with a paternal smile. "Maya, why don't you sit in the front row? We've saved a special seat for you." As the teachers filed onto the stage, Aunt Jo held me back for a moment. "Remember what I told you about Phyllis Wheatley?" she whispered. "How her former master's son took her to London to publish her book when no American publisher would touch it." I nodded, remembering the story. "Sometimes," she continued, "we need advocates, but sometimes we need to be the advocates, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us." She straightened my headband. "Today, I'm your advocate. Tomorrow you'll be someone else's. That's how change happens." The auditorium was packed, buzzing with the excited energy of over 400 students who were thrilled to have an unexpected break from regular classes. I took my seat in the front row, aware of curious glances from classmates who wondered about my special treatment. On stage, Principal Warner approached the microphone. "Students and faculty of Westridge Middle School, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's special guest, an award-winning author, a cultural commentator, and a woman whose words have inspired readers around the world. Please welcome Ms. Josephine Rivers." The applause was enthusiastic, especially from the teachers. Aunt Jo took the stage with the confident grace I'd always admired, smiling broadly as she approached the microphone. "Thank you for that warm welcome," she began. "It's a delight to be at Westridge today. I've heard wonderful things about this school, particularly its commitment to fostering a love of reading and critical thinking in young people. She launched into a captivating talk about the power of literature, how books had shaped her own life, and the responsibility that comes with storytelling. The students, who had initially seemed more excited about missing class than hearing a speaker, were quickly drawn in by her charisma and her knack for connecting complex ideas to their everyday experiences. The books we read in our youth shape us in profound ways, she said, pacing across the stage. They show us possibilities we might never have imagined for ourselves. They teach us empathy by allowing us to walk in shoes different from our own. But most importantly, they remind us that human experience, in all its diversity, is universal at its core. From my seat, I could see Mrs. Blackwell sitting stiffly at the edge of the stage, her expression carefully neutral. Principal Warner, by contrast, was nodding enthusiastically at every point Aunt Jo made. "I'd like to tell you about a personal hero of mine," Aunt Jo continued, her voice taking on a more intimate tone. "A young woman who lived over 2 centuries, ago, but whose story resonates powerfully today. Her name was Phyllis Wheatley." My heart skipped a beat as she began to tell Phyllis's story. Not just the basic facts, but the nuances, the context, the remarkable achievement of a young enslaved girl mastering a language and literary tradition not her own, then using that mastery to assert her humanity in a society that denied it. Phyllis Wheatley had to travel across an ocean to find a publisher willing to print her work, Aunt Jo explained. Even then, she needed the endorsement of 18 prominent white men who certified that she had indeed written her poems, because many refused to believe a young black girl could produce such sophisticated work. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the auditorium. We might think those days are long behind us, but I wonder, how often do we still place limitations on whose stories deserve to be told? Whose experiences we deem worthy of study? Whose voices we amplify and whose we silence? The auditorium had grown so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Even the usual restless shuffling of hundreds of middle schoolers had stilled. "Yesterday," Aunt Jo said, her voice dropping lower so that everyone had to lean in to hear. "My niece, who happens to be a student here at Westridge, attempted to research Phyllis Wheatley for a school assignment. She was turned away from the library and told that some books aren't for her." A ripple of whispers spread through the audience. I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me, but I kept my gaze fixed on Aunt Jo, drawing strength from her unwavering presence. "Now, I'm sure there was a misunderstanding," she continued smoothly. "I can't imagine an educational institution would intentionally limit a child's access to knowledge based on, well, based on what? Her age? Her reading level? Her appearance?" The question hung in the air, its implication clear to everyone. From the corner of my eye, I saw Principal Warner's smile falter as he glanced nervously at Mrs. Blackwell, whose face had gone pale. "I'd like to take this opportunity to address something important," Aunt Jo said, setting aside her notes and stepping closer to the edge of the stage. "Something I wish someone had said to me when I was your age." She looked directly at me, though her words were for everyone. "There will always be people who try to tell you what you can and cannot do, what you should and should not read, what you can and cannot become. These people may believe they're protecting you, or guiding you, or upholding some tradition they think is important." Aunt Jo's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "But here's what you need to know. No one has the right to limit your curiosity. No one has the authority to tell you which stories belong to you and which do not. Knowledge is not a scarce resource to be rationed. It is an abundant feast to which everyone deserves a seat. Principal Warner had risen from his chair and was approaching Aunt Jo, clearly intending to intervene, but she smoothly sidestepped him, continuing her address. "I've brought something special today," she announced, reaching into her bag and pulling out a stack of books. "Copies of Phyllis Wheatley's collected works for your school library. I have also arranged for a donation of books by diverse authors that reflect the full spectrum of human experience, so that every student at Westridge can see themselves in the literature they read." Principal Warner finally reached the microphone, his professional smile firmly in place, though his eyes betrayed his tension. "Thank you, Ms. Rivers, for that illuminating perspective. I want to assure you and all our students that Westridge is committed to inclusive education. Any incident that suggests otherwise was certainly a misunderstanding." "Of course," Aunt Jo replied pleasantly, not yielding the microphone. "Misunderstandings happen. That's why it's so important we address them openly, isn't it? Communication is key to building the kind of community where all children feel valued and all curiosities are nurtured." She turned to face the audience again. "Which reminds me, I have one more announcement. In honor of my visit today, I'd like to establish the Westridge Literary Horizon Scholarship. Each year, one student who demonstrates exceptional curiosity and courage in their literary explorations will receive a fully funded summer writing workshop at the Rivers Foundation in New York." Gasps and excited murmurs filled the auditorium. Principal Warner's expression transformed from barely concealed alarm to genuine delight. Even the teachers looked stunned by this unexpected generosity. "The first recipient," Aunt Jo continued, "will be selected based on an essay competition judged by a panel that includes myself and... Let's see. How about Mrs. Blackwell from your library? After all, who better to recognize literary curiosity than the guardian of your books?" Mrs. Blackwell looked as though she might faint. Principal Warner was nodding vigorously, clearly recognizing the PR opportunity this presented for the school. There was no way he could refuse such an offer, even with the implicit criticism it contained. "We would be honored," he said finally, managing to reclaim the microphone. "And now, do we have time for a few questions from our students?" The Q&A session that followed was lively, with students asking everything from how Aunt Jo got her ideas to whether she'd ever met any famous actors from the movie adaptation of her book. Through it all, she was gracious and engaging, treating even the silliest questions with respect. When the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, there was a collective groan of disappointment. "One last thing before you go," Aunt Jo said, as students began gathering their belongings. "Remember this. The most powerful words in any language are what if. Ask that question constantly. Question what you're told. Question what you read. Question what you believe. It's not disrespectful to question. It's how we grow. It's how humanity has always moved forward." As the auditorium emptied, Aunt Jo stepped down from the stage to where I waited. Behind her, I could see Principal Warner engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Mrs. Blackwell, their faces serious and their gestures animated. "You didn't tell me you were going to do all that," I said, a mixture of awe and embarrassment coloring my voice. "I didn't want you to worry," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "Besides, I meant every word. No one gets to tell you what knowledge belongs to you." She nodded toward where Principal Warner and Mrs. Blackwell were still talking. "I suspect you won't have any more trouble with the library." She was right. The next day, Mrs. Fowler was back at her post in the library, greeting me with her usual warm smile and a twinkle in her eye that suggested she'd heard all about Aunt Jo's visit. Mrs. Blackwell had taken a sudden leave of absence for personal reasons, though rumors suggested Principal Warner had strongly encouraged her time off. The scholarship Aunt Jo established became a coveted honor at Westridge. I didn't enter the first year. It felt wrong somehow, given my connection to the donor. But I watched as it transformed the school's approach to literature. Teachers began assigning more diverse reading material, and the library's collection expanded to include voices that had previously been absent or marginalized. As for my report on Phyllis Wheatley, I received an A+ with Ms. Peterson writing that it showed exceptional insight and a deep connection to the subject. The experience changed me. I became more conscious of the obstacles people face when seeking knowledge, more aware of the gatekeepers who decide whose stories get told and whose don't. It set me on a path that eventually led to my own career as an English professor specializing in early African American literature. But the story doesn't end there. 20 years after that day in the auditorium, I was giving a lecture at a community college in a small town about 200 miles from Westridge. The subject was, fittingly, Phyllis Wheatley and her contemporary reception. After the talk, as I gathered my notes, an older woman approached the podium. Her hair was now completely white, and deep lines framed her mouth. But I recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Blackwell," I said, surprised to find my heart racing after all these years. "Dr. Johnson," she replied, acknowledging my title with a slight nod. "That was an excellent lecture. Your passion for the subject is evident." I studied her face, searching for any sign of the woman who had blocked the library door all those years ago, but found only tiredness and something that looked like regret. "Thank you," I said cautiously. "I've followed your career," she continued, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "Your book on black female poets of the colonial period was illuminating. The irony wasn't lost on me. That my work had focused precisely on the subject she'd once deemed inappropriate for me. "I owe you an apology," she said abruptly, the words seeming to surprise her as much as they did me. "What I did that day, there's no excuse. I was wrong. I hadn't expected this. In my imagination, I'd confronted Mrs. Blackwell many times over the years, delivering eloquent speeches that left her ashamed and speechless. But now, faced with her voluntary contrition, I found myself at a loss. "I'd like to say I was a product of my generation," she continued when I didn't respond. "But that would be dishonest. Many of my contemporaries knew better. I simply didn't, or wouldn't." She met my eyes directly. "Your aunt made me see that, not just that day, but through her books, which I read afterward. All of them." I nodded, still processing this unexpected turn. "Why are you here?" I finally asked. "In this town, at this lecture?" "I live here now," she explained. "After I left Westridge, I couldn't find another teaching position. Your aunt's influence reached further than I anticipated." A rueful smile touched her lips. "I ended up working at the public library here until I retired last year. Fate has a sense of humor, I suppose." She hesitated, then added, "When I saw your name on the college events calendar, I knew I had to come, to see who you became, to say I'm sorry, and to thank you, in a way." "Thank me," I echoed. "Your experience, what I put you through, it changed the course of my life. I had to confront things about myself that were uncomfortable, It led me to do work I never would have considered, with populations I might never have served. She gestured to a young black woman waiting by the door. That's my granddaughter. She wants to be a writer, like your aunt, like you. The young woman waved shyly, and I returned the gesture, noting the book clutched in her hands. My book. Would you sign it for her? Mrs. Blackwell asked. She admires your work tremendously. As I signed the book for a girl who shared my passion for words, whose grandmother had once tried to limit my access to them, I felt the circle of our story completing itself in an unexpected way, not with triumph or vengeance, but with growth and connection. She has questions about applying to graduate programs in literature, Mrs. Blackwell added hesitantly. I told her you might not have time, but... I'd be happy to speak with her, I interrupted, making a decision in that moment. In fact, I'm starting a mentorship program at my university for underrepresented students interested in literary studies. She should apply. Relief and gratitude washed over Mrs. Blackwell's face. That's very generous of you. It's not generosity, I corrected gently. It's responsibility. We all have a duty to keep doors open for those who come after us. Later, as I drove back to my hotel, I called Aunt Jo, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, and told her about the encounter. Life has a way of bringing us full circle, she said after a moment of thoughtful silence. Not for closure, but for growth. You're doing the right thing, helping that girl. I learned from the best, I replied, thinking of that day when she had stood on stage and advocated not just for me, but for every child who had ever been told certain knowledge wasn't for them. Aunt Jo laughed, the sound as warm and familiar as it had been in our yellow kitchen 3 decades earlier. You know what Phyllis Wheatley wrote? In every human breast, God has implanted a principle, which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. She understood that the hunger for knowledge is part of that love of freedom. As I pulled into the hotel parking lot, I thought about Mrs. Blackwell's granddaughter, about Phyllis Wheatley, about the endless chain of seekers and gatekeepers that winds through human history. I thought about how sometimes the most powerful form of justice isn't punishment, but transformation, the moment when a gatekeeper becomes a guide instead. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have found it in your heart to help, the granddaughter of someone who once tried to limit your potential? Life presents us with these ironies, these opportunities to break cycles rather than perpetuate them. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and please share this story with someone who might need to be reminded that knowledge belongs to everyone, and that sometimes the greatest revenge is success shared generously with others. Every time I open a book, now, I remember that spring day and the words that nearly kept me from finding my path. Some books aren't for you, and I smile, knowing how wrong those words were. How every book that has ever been written is, in some way, for all of us. The only question is whether we'll have the courage to open them, to let them open us, and to share what we discover with those who come after.